Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's joint webinar between Access Point and Domain Guard. Today, we will be continuing our external monitoring series, focusing more on the threats that are beyond your domains. My name is Michael Swyben. I'm co-founder of Domain Guard. I have over 15 years of cybersecurity experience. The majority of my career has been in offensive security, conducting red team engagements, penetration testing, worked with a number of smart and intelligent individuals throughout my career. So it's been a privilege and an honor, and also working with a lot of different organizations. I essentially take my tradecraft to help our existing customers defend their networks in a much better way. I'll pass it on to my colleague, Erkin.
Thank you, Michael. My name is Erkin Gengiyev. I founded Domain Guard in 2021 as an external monitoring service provider, and the goal of Domain Guard being monitoring for the types of externally based threats that we've been showcasing in this webinar, ultimately with the goal of eradicating those same threats.
Thanks, Erkin. In today's lesson, we essentially will be understanding what your external threat landscape is, right? So that's beyond your perimeter network and what you have visibility into. We'll explore the dark web, adversarial forums, and other risks associated with your external perimeters, such as decentralized risk. And then we will also learn practical visibility and monitoring steps that will hopefully expand beyond your domain-focused defenses and really give you visibility into what you need from more of what the external landscape looks like. So why is this topic important? So the external attack surface has evolved, right? It's no longer just about your IPs, your domains, your cloud services. It now includes employee information on data broker sites, social media where there's postings, there's chatter about your organization. There are leaked credentials and mentions on pay sites, dark web forums, Telegram channels, Discord channels, and there's also other risks that your organization may not be aware of, which are handshake domains, right? So it's more decentralized. You don't have visibility into what those domains are. There's no good way of tracking them. And then there's also impersonations that are happening on your brand, leveraging search engine optimization, right, or ads, right, through Google. And the other component of why this is important is that because of all that chatter that's happening on the dark web forums or these underground forums, there are mentions of, what attackers are trying to do against your network, right? And then there's also other things that are important to your network, right? That could be exposed through other platforms such as GitHub, and where you have secrets exposed unintentionally, right? But a lot of this stuff is maybe not inside your network where you're constantly monitoring. It's outside, and it's those exposures that these threat actors are looking for and taking advantage of. So what are the threat exposure layers, right? So as you can see from left to right of this threat visibility, you have the dark web, you have adversarial forums, you have corporate assets. On the dark web, it's mostly external to your ecosystem. It's really difficult to get visibility into. You're not monitoring it continuously unless you have some kind of platform where you are, like a cyber threat intelligence platform where you do get that visibility, but it is much harder outside of what you typically watch for. And then as you move closer in on the adversarial forums, maybe you have some automation where you can kind of get insight into some of these breach dumps, things that are on Telegram or some other channels. But those adversarial forums are definitely selling like phishing kits. There's all that chatter that's going on. So maybe there's some slight visibility, but as you go further to the corporate assets, that's where you have like majority of what we've seen is that's where everyone has all their visibility, right? For the most part. Maybe some companies don't have full visibility because they're missing some shadow IT or something along those lines. But for the most part, what we've seen is the corporate entities, they definitely have more visibility on the right side, right, for their internal assets. So what we're trying to do here is trying to give insight into giving more visibility beyond that perimeter and things that you as an organization or as a business need to, and even as an individual, need to be aware of. So a lot of times when we talk about dark web or surface web, and people try to say, hey, what's the difference? There is definitely a difference. So the surface web is things that you can monitor, right? It's easy to do a Google search, right? A lot of the websites are, and the internet is kind of indexed, right, through these Google search engines, or other search engines that are out there. So you will have visibility into certain aspects. And the dark web is more along the lines of like it's underground networks, right? So you can't necessarily navigate to the dark web without some kind of secondary program, right? That's installed on your machine, and you can kind of do those additional searches, right? Find these marketplaces that are underground that typically won't see through a Google search. It's unindexed. There are, on the dark web, there are some platforms where, or some sites where it tries to index all those dark web sites, but it's not perfect. It's also an attacker's staging ground. So there's a lot of private communications that are going on, where they're talking. These threat actors are talking and communicating about your business, at your employees. Sometimes you can get visibility into it, and sometimes you can't. Sometimes these sites are invite only, and it's sometimes may be difficult to kind of get that invite so that you can start seeing what else these threat actors are discussing. And the dark web essentially is really a blind spot for most organizations. They don't have a way to essentially build platforms, log into all these sites, have the ability to get invited to these dark webs, these dark web platforms and forums where they can kind of listen essentially, right, to the chatter that's maybe targeting their employees or targeting their business. And from our experience, what we've typically have seen is that organizations, right, are heavily being discussed, right, in these adversarial forums, right? We see a lot of breach dumps, compromised credentials. We see phishing kits, right, that are being shared, right, in these underground marketplaces. And we also have seen where, exploits have been mentioned. Like, hey, I have this exploit to get into this VPN platform for this organization. I can sell it to you guys, right? So essentially, they're called initial access brokers, and essentially they already done kind of the exploitation, and they are selling that access for other threat actors to continue on, right? As part of whatever threat actors do, right? And they kind of want to either do ransomware or some other type of further access into your network to actually get data, hold that data for ransom, right, and try to actually get some kind of monetary gain out of what access they have and the data that they obtain.
Michael, do you also see target lists? For example, a list of banking domains or healthcare domains?
Yeah. So yeah, for banking and other like financial institutions, like target domains. Are you saying, elaborate a little bit more on the target domains?
So for example, if you were looking for the domain of a specific bank and then you saw that domain came up on the list, but then there was a number of different banks specific to that list, is that something you would describe as a target list for,
Yeah,
allowing attackers to just quickly target a whole slew of
yeah,
banks?
there are other, yes, correct. So we do see these threat actors essentially saying, hey, here goes these different retail banks in these different regions, right, that you may want to target, right? So they'll have like this index list of targets that they are working on, right, or may have access on, as well as maybe some regional banks that are in the same vicinity, right, that can be used as part of a targeted campaign. And they also have, like I said, these phishing kits as well that say, hey, I have this phishing kit for this domain in this region. No one's really monitoring it for impersonation, and here it is, and you can have at it, right? So definitely, yeah, we do see those targeted lists, as you mentioned. So I have a kind of like a realistic example of the dark web in action, right? So there was this travel company that we consulted for. They had a breach, over a year ago, where employee credentials were compromised through some mechanism. I won't get into the details of how they were breached or what was detailed in that breach. They had access to the individual's M365 account and some other access. And this is before our time, before we even started doing any work for those individuals, or that organization. And part of what we do and how we monitor is, we always are looking for, credentials that can be used that were part of a data breach, or things that, maybe the organization doesn't have visibility into. And during our monitoring, and during our engagement, we did discover that, that user was compromised through M365, which wasn't an entry point for us, right, to validate, because it was closed off. But there were other credentials that were tied to that individual that were not rotated, right? And it was a different username, right? But it was still tied to that individual, as what we can see in the data dumps. So we simulated that same type of threat vector, right, in attack scenario. We leveraged those credentials on another application that was hosted at the same organization's, on premise, or hosted at the same location that was still externally facing. That username, those credentials allowed us to authenticate in, because they weren't rotated. And again, this is over a year ago, right? So those credentials were still out there for over a year. And we essentially were able to, view the source of that application once we were authenticated in. And then we found another critical vulnerability inside that application that gave us access to other credentials, right? In clear text, right? So it was another vulnerability that we discovered, and then leveraged those credentials to then log into Office 365, because there was a gap in MFA deployment. But it just goes to show you that it is very critical to do this external monitoring. And again, where we found those credentials were on a Telegram bot channel, right? So, and I do have like a little snippet here, where essentially, what Telegram looks like and how people are posting these credentials. And they're free sometimes, right? You don't have to pay for them, which is also interesting. But it is interesting that, these credentials weren't used, right? Or that, they were used, but when we brought it to their attention, it was eye-opening, right? About, hey, maybe we need to continue to do dark web monitoring and look for credentials. And, it gives people insight if there is a breach, right? Or if there is a, compromised credentials, are there anything else tied to that individual?
Michael, so even though the organization deactivated that user's Office 365 account, they still had access to this web application that was built by this organization?
Correct. Yeah. So another set of credentials that were tied to that individual.
Gotcha.
But, again, even though that 365 account was, deactivated, or the password was rotated, right, where you couldn't use those other credentials, these other set of credentials were used for another application that was hosted by them. So it's a completely different authentication scheme, completely different set of credentials, no multi-factor authentication. And again, allowed us to, like I said, grab those other secondary credentials inside that application that then got us back into M365, which was a pretty cool attack path.
That's really interesting.
So from a monitoring component, right? And, this is where, you don't want to just monitor Telegram channels, right? You kind of want to look at the dark web forums, right? So something like Tor, which is the Onion network. And as you can see here, there's this Russian marketplace, which is interesting. And this is kind of where surface web bleeds into the dark web or underground networks. If you go to, russianmarket.io on the surface web, it redirects you to this Onion site, which is on the dark web, right? And you do need a special program to go to that marketplace. But it is interesting, right? How, you're buying surface web domains, and then they're kind of redirecting you to other domains on the underground forum. And then essentially to get access to these marketplaces, you need to register, right? Like you would on any kind of like e-commerce site. But before you can even start making any purchases, or even, getting access to some of the credentials or any other data that's on these marketplaces, you need to load cryptocurrency, right? Because everything is not going to be through like PayPal or credit card. They're going to use cryptocurrency like Monero or Bitcoin, stay anonymous essentially, right, with those transactions. But you want to monitor paste sites, right? Pastebin, Ghostbin, Telegram channels, Discord channels. And a lot of organizations, it'll be very difficult, right? Unless you have really intelligent team that, cyber threat intelligence team that, is building these programs. So what we've seen is a lot of organizations are using, dark web scanners, right? Like commercial scanners, cyber threat intelligence feeds. through, companies like ourselves, right, that can kind of monitor for this is typically what we see. We have seen teams use both like third-party solutions, cyber threat intelligence solutions, on top of other proprietary programs that they've built as well, as to enhance the monitoring where there may be some gaps or some other areas that they need to focus on. So it's really, really core, to monitor and leverage third parties when you can, right? These trusted third parties to give that intelligence that you need to take action or actionable, or take the intelligence, and it has to be actionable intelligence for you to kind of go ahead and respond, right? So essentially, there's the basics, right? We tell individuals and also organizations that, well, where do I start, right? What should I start? There's a gentleman, Troy Hunt, if I'm not mistaken, where he built this Have I Been Pwned site, this platform where you can register, you can actually buy a subscription, get a free subscription, but you can also just essentially search for your email address, put your email address in there, whether it's corporate or personal, and see if that account has been part of any data breaches, right? you know that platform also has ingested. They actually work with, I think, the FBI, right, and some of the the FBI to kind of get some additional data dumps as well. So they index it, search for your email address, see what gets hit, and then more than likely you should take action on it, right? So whether it's an old email address tied to an old social media account that you should deactivate, or maybe you need to start rotating your passwords a little bit more, or maybe even gives you an inkling to, maybe I need to put multi-factor authentication on these accounts, right, that I had that may have been breached, right? But it definitely is a starting point, but it will not contain every possible leak that's out there. So what we've seen between Have I Been Pwned is things that are known by that platform. And actually, it's all threat intelligence platforms. So not every threat intelligence platform is alike, right? They all don't have access to the same repositories that they monitor. So they all monitor for different things. But again, it may give you a starting point. But you could also monitor pay sites, right? Social media mentions. Another one we mentioned on another webinar, Erkin, was setting up, right, Google alerts, essentially, for your mention of your name, right? Or your organization as well, or even like executive employees too. And the goal here is to automate those alerts, right, for corporate emails, brand executives, because you can't just sit there and type it in all the time, right? You kind of need to set up some way of automating this. And Have I Been Pwned has an API that you can use, right, to kind of, tie into. You can, and that's more like a paid subscription, right, at the end of the day for that. But the goal is to definitely automate as much as this is possible so that you can get alerted to it the moment that it pops up. So we talked about, the dark web, surface web, adversarial forums, Telegram channels, right, where all this chatter is happening against your organization. Another threat that's beyond your ecosystem or your domain is something like these decentralized domains. And this is kind of new for us too, right? We've been seeing these handshake domains. These are kind of more like blockchain domains. And these domains, you can buy them on Namecheap, which is a registrar, or GoDaddy. And essentially you buy these domains that there's no really good routing capability from the normal internet, right, to this blockchain environment. Now, there are programs that are out there where you can, right, go from the regular internet, right, so to speak, and then kind of navigate to the handshake domains. But interesting enough, there is no ICANN oversight. There's no rules. And ICANN is this body that oversees the registrars and the registries to make sure that they are, responding to abuse reports, and taking action on malicious domains. Here, essentially, the handshake domains, there is no monitoring. There's no way to know when a new domain was bought or purchased, right, where ICANN just doesn't have visibility. And what we have seen with a customer is that their a handshake domain was purchased, and then it was sent an email through. The interesting thing about this is that if you reply back to that email, it doesn't route anywhere because it doesn't know where to route. There's no MX record, there's no A record, which is a host record that maps it to an IP address. There's nothing. But it is perfect for sending a spear phishing email, where you can essentially have like another link that goes somewhere else to a domain that can respond, like a phishing site. And it's really easy to impersonate your brand, right? And as you can see here, we have accesspointconsulting.services, which is a handshake domain, doesn't cost much, like $7, but can be used because some of these providers, these registrars, they will allow you to use that domain to send an email out, but again, it doesn't know where to route back, right? So you can only send emails out, right, using that registrar's mail platform. So it is interesting that we are seeing that. Again, it's not fully converged. It will at some point. We feel it will be converged, and it will become like an interesting threat vector. So we are on the lookout of looking for when those systems converge, but it's definitely interesting. And the dot services and dot io, dot ai impersonation is happening on those alternate TLDs as well. So it has been rising in kind of what we've been seeing. We've been seeing customers make announcements for trademarks, and the moment that happens, we're starting to see the trademark domains getting created with all these different TLDs assigned to it. So it is definitely the wild web out there. And if you don't have visibility into any of this stuff, then these threat actors are going to use whatever they can to kind of target your employees or your vendors or your customers. Another threat exposure that's beyond your domain is your brand and your people. So we're seeing executives being heavily targeted through WhatsApp as far as being impersonated through those channels. They also, a lot of people, including ourselves, like we have a tendency to overshare on LinkedIn, Facebook, right, X, and TikTok. Whether we're showing our home networks, right, whatever the case may be, like we're oversharing a lot of information. And really that becomes an attacker's playbook. So the more that you share, the more the threat actor is building their profile on you and the organization that you work for. If you're an engineer, IT engineer, what you have experience with working on, right, as far as the technology that you use, resumes, right, or, and job postings also say what technology stack that you're using from your organization. So there's just a lot of data, and these attackers are just mapping out what they can use, how they can kind of entice you to in a spear phishing campaign. And it's really alarming. I will say, don't forget about your executive assistants as well. They are also targeted. They typically have more access to certain sensitive data, and they will be targeted as well, as what we see. And not even targeting, as the corporate email, they're also trying to figure out what their personal email is as well, as far as a targeted phishing campaign. And with mobile workforces, right, where you're bringing your own device, if they're targeting, a personal executive assistant on their personal email, and it's outside of your network monitoring. What we've also seen with credential exposure on the dark web and these data dumps is malware is installed on the individual's machines, right? And now they had some kind of sync going on between the corporate credentials and their personal credentials, or they had access. And now the data is, for corporate information, the credentials are being, extrapolated from the personal machine, which is kind of interesting and kind of what we've seen, right? And we've helped the customer figure that out, right? Where we found these credentials, where it was used, and we saw credentials being exposed to their wireless network that really isn't exposed, right? So it is interesting to kind of see what's happening there from that angle. And again, attackers, if you do Google dorking, right, it's very easy to do. The Google Ads abuse as well, impersonating organizations with fake login pages, malware downloads. We're seeing an increase in that as well. And then data brokers, right? These data brokers are selling employee info. And, here's an example, and Erkin, sorry for using you as an example, but it is interesting that, if you search yourself, you'll see your name come up on these data brokers. And sometimes you have to register to even see this content. And it's amazing, where they get this information from, right? So they may get this information from, states' voter registration records, right? And then they take that information, because it's made publicly, and then now they are selling it on their own platform, which is, whether it's legal or not, I don't know, it's debatable. But again, the information is out there. They're tying to your family members, right? Where you last lived, right? As far as your previous address or your current address, your phone number, your cell phone number. I'm constantly inundated with text messages targeting me in spear phishing campaigns because my phone number, it was part of a data breach, right? And I haven't gotten rid of my phone number in like so many years, right? So and I don't think I would essentially get rid of my phone number as well, right? So wherever you can remove the data broker information, right, is kind of key, right, to kind of like help protecting you personally, but also like your organization. So what, as an organization or individual, like what can I do, right? So for organization, brand and legal teams, you should build these response playbooks for impersonation, right? So a lot of companies just don't know what to do with, hey, there's someone impersonating, where do I go, right? So you can use a third party, or you build out this playbook and say, hey, let's work with LinkedIn to take down this impersonating profile, or working with the registrar to take down this site that was impersonating your brand, right, or this domain, where you could file through a World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, or WIPO, where you can do trademark abuse on the domain itself, right? So there's a number of different things that you can do. You just need to put those playbooks together, right? You should also, go through the different bios, right, that are on executives' profiles and see what they can remove, right, if they want to. It's up to them, but educating them, saying, hey, don't reveal too much stuff, don't reveal too much where you're going or you're planning to go, right, in the future, even looking at your personal Facebook, and just being more conscientious of kind of what you're posting. Again, remove the sensitive data as needed. And then data broker removal services, very important to do as well. There's a lot of different services out there that you can leverage, including us, to help with removing some of the content that you saw for Erkin and getting that wiped out and removed from these data brokers. For security and IT teams, run exposure checks on the dark web, build an isolated environment where you can log into the dark web, Tor networks, right? These underground forums. Try to get access to these forums if you can. If you can't, leverage a third party, right, to help you out and get access and kind of monitor for you. And then obviously social media is important, whether it's Telegram or X. Just look for mentions, right? If people are mentioning, we've had individuals say, hey, I just typo squatted on this company, right? And it's like, no one knows about it, right? We've seen that posted on X, right? And then, we get aware of it. It's all part of, like, we already knew about it, right? But then, it's just interesting and it's comical, but, maybe you need to follow that threat actor, right? See what other forums are going on as part of the threat intelligence. And then from executives and leadership, really, really just, trying to, have a budget for the threat monitoring that's beyond your domains, and understanding why it's important. I have a ROE slide that we can talk about and why this is important. But you also, as an executive or the ELT, right, executive leadership team, you should definitely ask for monthly reports on credential leaks. If anything, it should be more than just monthly, but that's at a minimum. As an executive, there's so much that you need to worry about, but at least you can kind of see what the exposures are from like a monthly report or a weekly report. But your IT and security team should be getting alerted on those as they come up, right? So it shouldn't be just after a month, right? You shouldn't be looking for this stuff out. It should be on a more continuous basis. Brand impersonation alerts. Yep, getting those alerts, what's coming, and then what's the action, right? So what is your security team doing? What's your third party doing, right? Your trusted third party security solution. What are they doing to help kind of, do these takedowns of the impersonations and making sure that there's a proper workflow process in place. And then I guess the next one is prioritizing the brand and executive visibility, right? So the brand, right? A lot of companies may have multiple brands. Maybe you want to focus on the critical brands, but what we've seen is, not just focusing on your primary or parent domains, but all those sub domains, right? Sub brands that are important to your organization as well. So first things first, right? What can a threat actor find in just 5 minutes? That's what you should be thinking, right? As an individual, as an organization, start with Googling, right? Create these social media accounts for all these different platforms where your executives are on, and search, right? Hunt, essentially. If you're not, if you don't have a third party, do this on your own. Hunt, figure out who's impersonating you, and then also take action, right? You can report this stuff as well. You can search pay sites. It's out there. You can search for compromised credentials for X company. You can search all of that stuff if you want to. And then it's a little bit harder. I put in here audit handshake domains. It's probably difficult. The only way I could see you doing it right now, because it's kind of it's not centralized, is doing a query like how I did access point, dot services, right? Or access point for handshakes, and then see what comes up. See if anything has been purchased that's available or unavailable. That's one way of doing it, until there's some kind of centralized way of doing it. But it is being proactive by kind of seeing what's out there. And then any other lookalike domains on the regular domains that are routable, that's also pretty easy to do. You can also download, you can register through ICANN and get access to any newly registered domains, and you kind of build out that repository, whether your IT team could do it or your security team to kind of automate that. There are ways to do that stuff as well. So why is this important? Why, what's the return on investment? And I have a number of different categories. I may not go through them all, but the main category is phishing attacks, right? So, the cost without monitoring, business email compromises, people threat actors impersonating your organization, your domain. Once they're targeting someone, maybe your vendor, and kind of, trying to get them to do a wire transfer. What we've been seeing with our customers, it's like, $90,000 in an ACH transfer. But also it's not you got to take into account all of the time, right? So it may be 130,000 per incident, because your security team is now investigating, you're involving other people, you're involving outside consultants. So really, it can be costly, right? And, but what's the benefit with this external monitoring that's beyond your perimeter? You get early warnings on impersonating domains, impersonating social media accounts, fake login pages, right? And then you could take action on it, right? Before maybe it's being abused, or maybe in our experience, we've taken things down while it was actually happening, right? So, it spun up in 24 hours, right? We saw what was happening. We took action on it, and then it stopped the threat actor for communicating, right? Because that domain was seized, the social media account was taken down, and it stopped the threat actor dead in their tracks. So we've seen that and how that happened with our customers. Credential leaks, right? So like that example that I gave, if you don't have visibility into all the credentials that were compromised, and you're not thinking about rotating that individual's account and all the other accounts they're associated with, it's really easy to enter into the network, just as we did, right? In that example. So if you can block the stolen credentials before they're used, they're rotated. You're enforcing MFA, right? Where on platforms that you didn't know, had an MFA gap. Again, it's definitely benefit with having this early monitoring in place. So it is, again, being more about proactive. Domain and executive impersonation abuse, I kind of touched on that, along the way. But at the end of the day, if you don't have visibility into it, it can hurt your brand. It can hurt from a reputable perspective. We've had customers say, hey, someone's impersonating you again. And it's just a constant thing. But so it is a cat and mouse game. But again, if you can get visibility into it ahead of time and take action on it, the better that you're protecting your organization, right? Beyond just your perimeter, it's kind of like outside of your network. So the final takeaways: external threats go beyond your domain name, right? So, and then it's beyond your perimeter network. It's beyond your ecosystem internally. These adversaries, what we see in the chatter that goes on with them is kind of, they're really organized, right? Well, some of them are organized, right? The advanced ones are very organized, and they operate in those shadows, right? So, protecting your brand and people requires awareness of what's visible and value to them, and then what's going to be valuable to you. So the first step: start looking where attackers are. So that's kind of the end of this pillar. We have a number of different pillars as well to be on the lookout for. Just want to say thank you to Access Point for having us, and thank you for joining this webinar, and really appreciate your time.